The blood-soaked sun hung low over the horizon as Elizabeth Carrington strained against the ropes binding her wrists to the wooden post in Aspen's town square. Sweat and grime streaked her face, but her eyes remained defiant, even as Sheriff Wilson raised the whip for another strike. The year was 1876, and Colorado had just gained its statehood, but here in Aspen, nestled in the Rocky Mountains, the law was still as wild as the untamed land surrounding it. 15 lashes for theft and disrespecting the court, the sheriff announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying across the dusty square. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can defy the law in my town. Elizabeth bit down hard on her lip as the whip cracked through the air again. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing her scream. She hadn't stolen anything, she'd merely taken back what was rightfully hers after the mining company had seized her late father's claim through falsified documents. From the edge of the crowd, a tall figure watched, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Patrick Calloway's hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip as the whip came down again. He'd ridden into Aspen just 3 days ago, tracking rumors of silver strikes and a fresh start. What he found instead was corruption wearing the face of law and order. The whip cracked a 5th time, and Elizabeth's knees buckled, though she remained upright through sheer force of will. "That's enough, Sheriff," Patrick called out, stepping forward from the crowd. His voice carried authority that made several onlookers turn. Sheriff Wilson paused, the whip still raised. "This ain't your business, stranger." Patrick's spurs jingled softly as he took another step forward. "I'm making it my business." His eyes met Elizabeth's for a moment. Pain and pride mingled in her gaze, and something in his chest tightened. "This woman's been sentenced by the court. Stand back or join her," Wilson threatened, gesturing to his deputies who had already placed hands on their weapons. 5 lashes was the sentence for theft in any civilized territory, Patrick replied calmly. "And I don't see any theft happening here, just a woman standing up for what's rightfully hers." Elizabeth's breath came in ragged gasps, but she raised her head slightly, surprise evident in her expression as this stranger defended her. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Wilson demanded. Patrick pushed his coat back, revealing not only his revolver but also a silver badge pinned to his vest. "Patrick Calloway, U.S. Marshal, and I believe you're exceeding your authority, Sheriff." The crowd murmured, and Wilson's face darkened. "We haven't received word of any federal marshal coming to Aspen. That's the point of investigating corruption, Sheriff. You don't send a telegram announcing it." Patrick moved closer to Elizabeth. "Now cut her down." For a tense moment, it seemed Wilson might refuse, but with too many witnesses and the uncertain legitimacy of the marshal's claim, he finally nodded to a deputy who approached with a knife. As the ropes fell away, Elizabeth collapsed. Patrick caught her before she hit the dirt, her weight slight against his chest. "That fire in you lights my way home, madam," he whispered, so only she could hear. "Don't let them put it out." Her eyes, glazed with pain, focused on his face. "I don't need your help," she managed through gritted teeth. "Maybe not," Patrick replied, "but you're getting it anyway." With gentle movements that belied his rugged appearance, Patrick lifted Elizabeth and carried her through the dispersing crowd. Behind them, Sheriff Wilson called out, "This isn't over, Marshal. Not by a long shot." Patrick didn't turn back. He knew the sheriff spoke true. This was just the beginning. Dr. Samuel Miller's office sat at the end of Aspen's Main Street, a modest building with a shingle that had seen better days. Patrick kicked the door gently, unable to knock with Elizabeth in his arms. The elderly doctor opened the door, his spectacles sitting low on his nose. His eyes widened at the sight before him. "Good Lord, what happened?" "Sheriff Wilson's idea of justice," Patrick replied, carrying Elizabeth inside. "She needs care." Dr. Miller cleared a table. "Set her down here, gently now." Patrick laid Elizabeth down, careful not to aggravate her injuries. She had fallen silent during their walk, consciousness slipping away despite her attempts to stay alert. "You'll need to wait outside," the doctor instructed, already gathering supplies. "I'm staying," Patrick said firmly. "Sheriff Wilson might decide to finish what he started." Dr. Miller evaluated him with a shrewd gaze, then nodded. "Very well. Make yourself useful and fetch water from the pump out back." Patrick did as instructed, returning with a bucket of cool water. The doctor had already cut away the blood-soaked fabric covering Elizabeth's back, revealing angry welts that crossed her pale skin. "These will scar," Dr. Miller said grimly as he began to clean the wounds. "Wilson's getting more heavy-handed by the month." Elizabeth stirred, a soft moan escaping her lips as the cold water touched her raw skin. "Easy now," Patrick said, moving to where she could see him. "You're safe." Her eyes, the color of a summer storm, focused on his face. "Marshall," she whispered, recognition dawning. "Patrick Calloway," he offered. "Elizabeth Carrington," she replied, her voice strained. "Though I suspect you already knew that," he nodded. "I've been in town long enough to hear about the Carrington claim dispute." A shadow crossed her face. "Then you know I'm not a thief." "I know there's more to the story than what Sheriff Wilson is telling," Patrick replied carefully. "Rest now. We'll talk when you're stronger." Dr. Miller worked methodically, cleaning each wound before applying a salve that smelled of herbs and whiskey. "This will help prevent infection, but she'll need rest, at least a week." Elizabeth tried to push herself up. "I don't have a week. If I don't work my father's claim, the mining company will seize it permanently." "You're in no condition to work any claim," the doctor admonished. Patrick placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, stopping her attempt to rise. "Tell me where the claim is. I'll make sure it's secure." Suspicion flickered in her eyes. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "I know injustice when I see it," he replied simply. "And I've seen enough of it for one day." Something in his steady gaze must have convinced her, for after a moment's hesitation, she said, "Deadman's Gulch, 3 miles north of town. There's a small cabin and the mine entrance is marked with a cross cut into the rock face." Patrick nodded. "I'll ride out at first light." "The mining company has men watching it," she warned. "They're waiting for me to miss a day's work. Let me worry about that." Patrick turned to Dr. Miller. "Can she be moved? She shouldn't stay in town with Wilson looking for any excuse to finish what he started." The doctor hesitated. "Normally I'd say no, but you're right about Wilson. He won't let this go." He began gathering bandages and bottles. "I have a small house outside town. My late wife's sister lives there. It would be safer than here." "Thank you," Elizabeth whispered, her strength clearly fading. "Rest now," Patrick said softly. "I'll keep watch." As darkness fell over Aspen, Patrick stood at the window of Dr. Miller's office watching the street. A few lamps had been lit, casting pools of yellow light on the muddy thoroughfare. The saloon across the way bustled with activity, miners and cowboys alike seeking solace in whiskey and cards. Patrick's fingers absently traced the badge on his vest. It wasn't his, not anymore. He'd turned in his marshal's badge 2 years ago after the incident in Laramie. But he'd kept it, a reminder of the man he once was and the oath he'd taken. Today was the first time he'd worn it since then, an impulse decision when he saw Elizabeth tied to that post. Behind him, Elizabeth shifted on the examination table, a soft moan escaping her lips. Patrick turned, watching as her eyes fluttered open. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "A couple of hours," Patrick replied, moving to her side. "How's the pain?" "Bearable," she lied, though the tightness around her eyes told a different story. Patrick poured water from a pitcher into a cup and helped her drink. Dr. Miller has gone to prepare transportation to his sister-in-law's place. We'll move you once it's fully dark. Elizabeth nodded, then regarded him with renewed suspicion. That badge, you're really a U.S. Marshal. Patrick hesitated. I was, not anymore. So you lied to Sheriff Wilson, I implied, Patrick corrected. Sometimes the suggestion of authority is enough. A hint of a smile touched Elizabeth's lips. That was foolish. Wilson could have shot you. He could have tried, Patrick replied with quiet confidence. Elizabeth studied him, her gaze more lucid now. Why did you interfere? Truly, Patrick was saved from answering by Dr. Miller's return. The elderly doctor entered quietly, removing his hat. The wagon's ready out back. Miss Carrington, I've prepared a draft for the pain. You'll want to take it before we move you. Elizabeth accepted the small bottle, grimacing at the bitter taste. Patrick gathered her carefully in his arms, mindful of her injuries. She was lighter than she should be. He realized a woman who'd been working too hard with too little to show for it. They exited through the back door where a covered wagon waited, its interior padded with blankets. Patrick placed Elizabeth on her side, arranging the coverings to keep her comfortable without pressing on her wounds. I'll drive, Patrick told the doctor. You've done enough. Dr. Miller nodded, passing him the reins. Follow the north trail past the creek. It's the only cabin for miles, you can't miss it. Martha knows you're coming. She'll have everything ready. Patrick climbed onto the driver's seat. Thank you, doctor. I won't forget this. Dr. Miller's expression grew serious. Be careful, Marshal, or whatever you are. Wilson has friends in high places, including the Rocky Mountain Mining Company. I've noticed, Patrick replied dryly. Good night, doctor. The wagon creaked as it pulled away from town, the horses' hooves muffled in the soft dirt. Patrick kept the pace slow, mindful of his passenger. Above them, stars pricked the velvet darkness, unnaturally bright in the clear mountain air. You still haven't answered my question. Elizabeth's voice came from inside the wagon. Why help me? Patrick guided the horses around a rut before responding. Where I come from, a man doesn't stand by while a woman is abused, regardless of what she's accused of. And where is that? Texas. Small town called Redemption. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Appropriate name for a former lawman. Patrick glanced back at her. What about you? You're not originally from Aspen. No, she confirmed. Boston. My father brought me west after my mother died. He believed the mountains held silver that would make us rich. Her laugh held no humor. Instead, they hold his bones, and I'm left fighting for what's rightfully ours. How long has your father been gone? 6 months. The mining company moved in almost immediately, claiming his death invalidated his stake. When I protested, they produced papers showing he'd sold the claim before his death. Her voice hardened. Forgeries, all of them. My father would never have sold that mine. And that's why you took the documents, Patrick surmised. I didn't steal them, I reclaimed them, Elizabeth corrected. They were in my father's strongbox. The mining company had no right to them. The wagon crossed a small stream, water splashing beneath the wheels. And for that, Wilson sentenced you to public whipping. Sheriff Wilson is in the mining company's pocket, Elizabeth said bitterly. Along with the judge and half the town council, they want to make an example of me. Patrick fell silent, considering her words. Corruption was nothing new in boomtowns like Aspen, where silver strikes could make fortunes overnight. But there was something about Elizabeth's situation that struck him as particularly unjust, or perhaps it was simply the woman herself, with her fierce determination despite overwhelming odds. We're here, he announced as a small cabin came into view, a single lamp burning in the window. It was a sturdy structure built of logs, with a stone chimney from which smoke curled into the night sky. As the wagon pulled up, the door opened to reveal an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun. "Dr. Samuel said you'd be coming," she called out, stepping onto the porch. "Bring the poor girl inside. I've got hot water and fresh bandages ready." Patrick lifted Elizabeth from the wagon, noting that the doctor's draft had taken effect. Her body was more relaxed, her eyes heavy-lidded. She didn't protest as he carried her inside. The cabin was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and handmade furniture arranged thoughtfully throughout the single room. A curtain partitioned off what appeared to be a sleeping area. "Put her on the bed behind the curtain," Martha instructed, already moving to gather her supplies. "I'll tend to her wounds." Patrick laid Elizabeth gently on the bed, their eyes meeting briefly. "I'll check on your claim at first light," he promised quietly. Her hand caught his wrist, surprising him with its strength. "Be careful," she whispered. "They won't hesitate to kill for that silver." He covered her hand with his own. "Neither will I if it comes to that." He meant it. He realized this woman and her cause had somehow become his own in the span of a few hours. As Martha shooed him away, Patrick retreated to the main room, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. He settled into a chair by the fire, his revolver within easy reach. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight at least, Elizabeth was safe, and that, he decided, was enough for now. The pre-dawn light filtered through the cabin windows as Patrick checked his revolver one last time before holstering it. He'd spent the night in the chair, dozing occasionally but mostly listening for any approach. None had come. Martha emerged from behind the curtain, wiping her hands on her apron. "She's sleeping now," she said softly. "The fever broke an hour ago." Patrick nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Will she be all right here while I'm gone?" "I raised 5 children and buried a husband," Martha replied with a hint of amusement. "I think I can manage one injured young woman." "I don't doubt it," Patrick said with a small smile, "but Sheriff Wilson isn't an ordinary threat." Martha's expression hardened. "I know Wilson's type. Been dealing with men like him my whole life. Don't you worry about us. I keep a shotgun by the door and know how to use it." Patrick touched the brim of his hat in respect. "Yes, madam. I'll be back by nightfall." "There's coffee on the stove," Martha offered, "and I packed some biscuits for your ride." Patrick accepted the cloth-wrapped package gratefully. "Thank you for your kindness." "Thank me by helping that girl keep what's rightfully hers," Martha replied. "There's too little justice in this world as it is." With a nod, Patrick stepped outside into the cool morning air. The mountains loomed above, their peaks touched with the first golden rays of sunrise. He saddled his horse, a sturdy black gelding named Midnight, and secured his Winchester rifle in its scabbard. The ride to Deadman's Gulch took less than an hour. Patrick approached cautiously, dismounting and leading Midnight the final quarter-mile through the pines. The cabin Elizabeth had mentioned came into view, a simple one-room structure next to a cleared area where mining equipment sat partially covered with canvas. Patrick tied Midnight in a sheltered spot and continued on foot, moving silently through the underbrush. As he neared the cabin, he spotted 2 men sitting outside, rifles across their laps. They wore no uniforms or badges, but their purpose was clear guards stationed to prevent Elizabeth from working her claim. Patrick circled wide, approaching the mine entrance first. Just as Elizabeth had described, a cross was cut into the rock face beside a timber-reinforced opening that led into darkness. Fresh boot prints in the mud indicated recent activity. Someone had been in the mine, and recently, Patrick returned to the cabin, considering his options. A direct confrontation with armed men wasn't ideal, but neither was returning to Elizabeth without securing her claim. The decision was made for him when a wagon approached from the direction of Aspen, carrying 3 more men. One, dressed in an expensive suit despite the early hour and rough terrain, appeared to be in charge. The others were clearly hired muscle, their expressions hard beneath their hats. Patrick settled behind a large boulder, close enough to overhear their conversation. "Any sign of the Carrington woman?" the well-dressed man asked as he dismounted. "No, sir, Mr. Blackwood," one of the guards replied. "Not since yesterday morning when the sheriff took her in." "Good." The man called Blackwood straightened his cuffs. "She'll be occupied for some time after her punishment. That gives us the opportunity we need." "What about the marshal who interfered?" the second guard asked. Blackwood waved a dismissive hand. "Wilson is checking his credentials." "I doubt he's actually a federal marshal, more likely some drifter playing hero. He'll be dealt with." "And if he shows up here, then deal with him," Blackwood said coldly. "This claim becomes property of the Rocky Mountain Mining Company at sundown unless Miss Carrington appears to work it." "I want no interference." Patrick's jaw tightened as he listened. The mining law required claims to be worked regularly to remain valid typically. Missing more than 10 consecutive days of work could result in forfeiture. Elizabeth had mentioned the company was waiting for her to miss a day, suggesting she was nearing that limit. "What about the new vein, sir?" one of the men asked. "Should we continue excavating?" Blackwood nodded. "Get as much ore out as you can before we officially claim the mine. Load it in the wagon and cover it well. I don't want anyone seeing what we're taking." So that was it, Patrick thought. They'd found a rich vein in Elizabeth's mine and were stealing her silver while preventing her from working the claim. Once they'd taken what they could easily reach, they'd seize the mine legally and continue operations openly. Patrick had seen similar schemes throughout the West, big companies using legal technicalities to rob independent miners of their claims. It was precisely the kind of injustice he'd sworn to fight as a marshal before everything went wrong in Laramie. He waited until Blackwood and 2 of the men entered the mine, leaving 1 guard at the cabin and another watching the entrance. Then he moved. The guard at the cabin never saw Patrick coming. A quick blow to the back of the head with his revolver butt, and the man crumpled silently to the ground. Patrick bound his hands and feet with the man's own belt and bandana, then approached the mine entrance. The second guard was more alert, turning at the sound of Patrick's deliberately heavy footsteps. "Morning," Patrick called casually, his hands visible but not far from his holstered weapon. The guard's rifle came up. "This is private property. Turn around and ride out." "Funny," Patrick replied, still approaching. "I was under the impression this claim belonged to Elizabeth Carrington." Recognition dawned in the guard's eyes. "You're that marshal from town." His finger tightened on the trigger. "Mr. Blackwood said you might show up." "Did he mention what would happen if you pointed that rifle at a federal officer?" Patrick asked, his voice hardening. 5 years in a territorial prison at minimum." The guard hesitated, uncertainty flashing across his face. That moment of doubt was all Patrick needed. He drew and fired in one smooth motion, not at the man, but at the rifle itself. The bullet struck the weapon's stock, sending it spinning from the guard's hands. Before the man could recover, Patrick closed the distance between them, delivering a powerful right hook that sent the guard sprawling. Like his companion, this one was quickly bound and left propped against a tree. Patrick paused at the mine entrance, listening. Voices echoed from within, along with the sound of pickaxes striking rock. Drawing his revolver, he stepped into the darkness. The tunnel sloped downward, timber supports placed at regular intervals. Oil lamps hung from hooks, casting long shadows. Patrick moved carefully, alert for any sign he'd been detected. Around a bend, the tunnel widened into a small chamber where Blackwood stood watching as the two remaining men worked at the far wall. A lantern illuminated a gleaming vein of silver ore running through the rock face. "Work faster," Blackwood urged. "I want this wagon loaded and back in town before anyone realizes what we're doing." "This is high-grade ore, sir," one of the workers responded, prying a chunk loose. "Worth a small fortune." "And legally mine by sundown," Blackwood said smugly. "I'm afraid I have to disagree with that assessment," Patrick announced, stepping into the chamber with his revolver raised. "Drop your tools and raise your hands, all of you." The workers froze, then slowly complied. Blackwood, however, turned with remarkable composure, adjusting his spectacles as he regarded Patrick. "Ah, the alleged marshal," he said smoothly. "I wondered if we might meet." "Richard Blackwood, I presume," Patrick replied, keeping his weapon trained on the man. "You're trespassing on Miss Carrington's claim," Blackwood smiled thinly. "Am I? The law states quite clearly that a claim must be worked regularly. Miss Carrington hasn't been seen here today, nor will she be, given her condition." "She sent me as her representative," Patrick countered. "Which is perfectly legal under the mining code. And what I find interesting is that you're removing ore before the claim is officially yours." "A misunderstanding," Blackwood said with a dismissive wave. "We were merely assessing the value of the property by loading silver into your wagon." Patrick took a step closer. "That's theft, Mr. Blackwood, and I have a feeling the territorial governor would be very interested to hear about it along with your arrangement with Sheriff Wilson." A flash of genuine concern crossed Blackwood's face before his confident mask returned. "You're bluffing. You're not even a real marshal." Patrick smiled. "Want to wager your freedom on that assumption? Because right now I have two witnesses who can testify about your operation here, plus whatever documents Miss Carrington recovered from her father's strongbox." Uncertainty replaced Blackwood's confidence. He glanced at his men, then back at Patrick. "What do you want?" "First, you and your men are going to walk out of this mine and leave this claim," Patrick said firmly. "Second, you're going to sign a document acknowledging that the Carrington claim remains valid and that your company has no legal interest in it. Third, you're going to compensate Miss Carrington for the ore you've already taken." "Or what?" Blackwood challenged, though with less conviction than before. "Or I'll escort you to Denver myself to face charges of theft, corruption, and conspiracy," Patrick replied. "Your choice, Mr. Blackwood. Make it now." For a tense moment, Patrick thought Blackwood might refuse. But the businessman was nothing if not practical. With a curt nod, he gestured to his men. "We'll discuss terms outside," he conceded. Patrick kept his revolver ready as he followed the three men from the mine. Outside, Blackwood's composure slipped when he saw his guards bound and unconscious. "You'll regret this," he hissed at Patrick. "The Rocky Mountain Mining Company has powerful friends." "So do I," Patrick lied smoothly. "Now about that document." By midday, Patrick had what he came for: a signed confession and renunciation of all claims to Elizabeth's mine, along with a bank draft for $500 as compensation for the ore already removed. It wasn't as much as the silver was worth, but it was enough to keep Elizabeth's claim operational for months. As Blackwood and his men departed, Patrick called after them. "If I see any of you near this claim again, our next meeting won't be so civilized." The threat hung in the air as the wagon disappeared down the trail toward Aspen. Patrick knew Blackwood wouldn't give up so easily. Men like him never did, but for now, Elizabeth's mine was secure. Patrick spent the next few hours exploring the claim, impressed by the richness of the silver vein Blackwood had been exploiting. Elizabeth's father had indeed found a valuable deposit, one worth fighting for. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Patrick secured the cabin and mine entrance, then mounted midnight for the ride back to Martha's place. He carried with him not just the document and bank draft, but also a small pouch of silver ore as tangible proof of the mine's value. The weight of it in his saddlebag felt like a promise one he intended to keep. Elizabeth was sitting upright in bed when Patrick returned, her back carefully positioned away from the headboard, her face pale but alert. Martha had helped her into a clean dress, and her hair had been brushed and plaited into a long braid that hung over one shoulder. "You're looking better," Patrick observed as he entered, removing his hat. Relief flashed across Elizabeth's features, quickly masked by practiced composure. "And you're unharmed. I was concerned when you didn't return by afternoon." Patrick smiled slightly at her attempt to hide her worry. "I had some negotiations to complete." He pulled the document and bank draft from his coat, along with the pouch of ore. "Your claim is secure, Miss Carrington. And this should help with operating costs." Elizabeth's eyes widened as she examined the papers and the silver samples. "How did you manage this?" Patrick recounted his confrontation with Blackwood and his men, though he downplayed the danger. "They were more interested in profit than fighting," he concluded. "Once I convinced Blackwood that his reputation and freedom were at risk, he became quite reasonable." Martha, who had been listening from her rocking chair by the fire, snorted. "Richard Blackwood wouldn't know reasonable if it sat in his lap and called him Papa. You must have put a proper fear in him, Mr. Calloway." Patrick shrugged. "Fear can be persuasive, especially when backed by evidence of wrongdoing." Elizabeth studied Patrick with newfound respect. "This doesn't end it, you know. Blackwood will try again, perhaps more subtly next time." "Probably," Patrick agreed. "But now you have legal documentation reaffirming your ownership, signed by Blackwood himself. That will make his next attempt more difficult." Elizabeth carefully set the papers aside. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway, I'm in your debt." "Patrick," he corrected gently, "and there's no debt between us." Martha rose from her chair. "I'll leave you two to talk while I prepare supper." Her knowing glance between them suggested she saw more than either wanted to admit. Once Martha had busied herself at the stove, Elizabeth spoke softly. "Why are you really helping me, Patrick? And please don't say it's because you couldn't stand by and watch injustice. There's more to it than that." Patrick considered her question, looking into the flickering fire. 2 years ago, I was a marshal in Wyoming," he finally said. "I believed in the law and justice. Then I arrested the son of a powerful rancher for murder. There was no doubt of his guilt. 3 witnesses saw him shoot a homesteader in cold blood." He paused, the painful memory etched in the lines of his face. "The night before the trial, men working for the rancher killed the witnesses. All 3. The judge, who owed his position to the rancher's influence, dismissed the case for lack of evidence. The killer walked free, laughing as he left the courthouse." Elizabeth's expression softened. "What did you do?" "What any man with a conscience would do," Patrick replied, his voice hardening. "I confronted him. Words were exchanged, then bullets. When it was over, he was dead, and I'd violated every principle I'd sworn to uphold." "You killed him," Elizabeth stated, not as an accusation but as understanding. Patrick nodded once. "I resigned my position the next day and have been drifting ever since. So when I say I understand injustice, Elizabeth, I mean I've seen it corrupt everything I once believed in." Elizabeth reached out, her fingers brushing his hand where it rested on the bed. "And when you saw me tied to that post, I saw another powerful man abusing his position to harm someone who couldn't fight back," Patrick admitted. "But I also saw something I haven't seen in a long time, someone with the courage to stand against it, even knowing the cost. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. "That fire in you," Patrick said softly, echoing his words from the town square. "It reminded me of who I used to be, who I want to be again." Elizabeth's fingers tightened on his. "And what happens now?" Before Patrick could answer, hoofbeats sounded outside the cabin. In an instant he was on his feet, gun drawn, moving to the window. "3 riders," he reported, peering through a gap in the curtains. "Sheriff Wilson and 2 deputies." Martha appeared at his side, a shotgun in her weathered hands. "They won't take her while I'm breathing," she declared firmly. Patrick touched the old woman's shoulder. "Let me handle this, Martha. Keep Elizabeth hidden." He moved to the door, adjusting his vest to ensure the marshal's badge was visible. It wasn't a lie he enjoyed perpetuating, but it might be the only thing keeping Wilson from immediate violence. Stepping onto the porch, Patrick closed the door firmly behind him. "Evening, Sheriff," he called as the riders approached. "You're a long way from town." Wilson dismounted, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "Marshal Calloway," he replied, the title dripping with skepticism. "I've come for Elizabeth Carrington. She's wanted for theft and escaping custody." Patrick leaned against the doorframe, deliberately casual. "Funny thing about that theft charge, Sheriff. I visited Miss Carrington's claim today and had an interesting conversation with Richard Blackwood." Wilson's expression darkened. "What's Blackwood got to do with this?" "Everything, I'd say." Patrick withdrew the signed document from his coat. He admitted the documents Miss Carrington supposedly stole were, in fact, forgeries created by the mining company to seize her claim. He's withdrawn all charges and compensated her for damages. "Blackwood would never," Wilson began, then stopped abruptly, uncertainty crossing his face. Patrick pressed his advantage. "He also mentioned your arrangement, something about a percentage of the mine's profits in exchange for your cooperation. The territorial governor might find that information enlightening." The deputies exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the turn in conversation. Wilson's face flushed with anger. "You're bluffing. Blackwood would never implicate himself." "Men facing prison will say remarkable things," Patrick replied evenly, "especially when confronted with evidence of their crimes. Now, unless you have a valid warrant, one not based on Blackwood's false claims, I suggest you turn around and ride back to town." Wilson took a step forward, his hand tightening on his gun. "I don't know who you really are, Calloway, but you're interfering in Aspen business. That's dangerous for a man's health." Patrick's expression hardened, all pretense of casualness vanishing. "I wouldn't draw that weapon, Sheriff. Not unless you're certain you're faster than I am." The quiet confidence in his voice gave Wilson pause. "And even if you are, consider this. I've already sent copies of Blackwood's confession to the territorial governor and the Denver newspapers. If anything happens to me or Miss Carrington, they'll be published immediately." It was another bluff, but delivered with such conviction that doubt crept into Wilson's eyes. "You're making a powerful enemy," Wilson warned, though his hand moved away from his gun. "Not the first time," Patrick replied. "Likely won't be the last." For a tense moment the outcome hung in the balance. Then Wilson spat on the ground, turned, and remounted his horse. "This isn't over, Calloway." "It is for tonight," Patrick answered. He remained on the porch, unmoving, as the 3 riders departed down the trail toward Aspen. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Patrick release the breath he'd been holding. Another confrontation avoided, but Wilson was right about one thing: it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When he re-entered the cabin, he found Elizabeth standing behind the curtain, Martha supporting her with an arm around her waist. "You should be resting," Patrick admonished gently. "I heard everything. Elizabeth said, ignoring his concern. "You've made powerful enemies on my behalf, Patrick." "They were already my enemies," he replied. "They just didn't know it yet." Martha guided Elizabeth back to the bed. "You need to lie down, child. Your back's starting to bleed through the bandages again." As Elizabeth settled carefully onto the bed, she caught Patrick's gaze. "Thank you," she said simply. Patrick nodded, understanding the depth of gratitude behind those two words. "Rest now. Tomorrow we'll need to make plans." "We?" Elizabeth questioned, a small smile touching her lips despite her pain. "Unless you'd prefer I move on," Patrick offered, suddenly uncertain. "No," Elizabeth replied quickly, then more measured. "No, I think we make a good team, Marshal Calloway." Patrick smiled at the deliberate use of the title. "So do I, Miss Carrington, so do I." The next week passed in relative calm. Elizabeth's wounds began to heal. Though the doctor's prediction proved true, she would carry the scars of Wilson's whip for life. Patrick split his time between helping Martha around the cabin and riding out to check on the Carrington claim, ensuring Blackwood's men kept their distance. On the 8th day, Elizabeth insisted on accompanying him to the mine, despite Martha's protests. "I need to see it," she explained as Patrick helped her into the wagon he'd borrowed from Dr. Miller. "I need to know it's still there, still mine." Patrick understood. Some assurances required seeing with one's own eyes. The journey was slow, with Patrick carefully guiding the wagon around every bump and rut to minimize Elizabeth's discomfort. She sat beside him on the bench, straight-backed despite the pain it must have caused her, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "Tell me about your father," Patrick requested as they traveled, partly to distract her from the discomfort. Elizabeth's expression softened at the mention of her father. "Edward Carrington was a dreamer," she began. "A Boston businessman who lost everything in the panic of '73. My mother had already passed, and with nothing left to lose, he decided to seek his fortune in the West." "And he brought you with him," Patrick observed. Elizabeth nodded. "I was 19, educated but sheltered. Boston society had prepared me to be a wife, not a miner's daughter." A small smile touched her lips. "The first time Father handed me a pan for gold, I thought he'd lost his mind. Yet here you are, fighting for his claim." "It became our claim," Elizabeth corrected. "I learned to pan, to recognize ore, even to handle dynamite. Father said I took to it like I was born to the mountains." Her smile faded. "When he died, a cave in that I've always suspected wasn't entirely accidental. Continuing his work was the only choice I could make." Patrick glanced at her with newfound respect. "Most Boston ladies would have sold the claim and returned east." "Perhaps," Elizabeth acknowledged. "But Father used to say that silver wasn't just in the ground, it was in our blood now." He was right. As they crested a small rise, the Carrington claim came into view. The cabin stood as Patrick had left it, undisturbed. They approached slowly, Patrick's hand near his revolver despite the apparent calm. "It looks exactly as it did when Father was alive," Elizabeth murmured as Patrick helped her down from the wagon. "No sign of Blackwood's men since I ran them off," Patrick confirmed, "though I doubt they've given up entirely." Elizabeth moved slowly toward the cabin, her hand trailing over the rough-hewn logs. "Father built this himself. Said a man should have a proper roof over his head, even in the wilderness." Patrick watched her reconnect with her home, understanding the significance of this moment. "Would you like to see the mine entrance? There's something I think you should know." With careful steps, they made their way to the mine. Patrick lit a lantern and guided Elizabeth into the tunnel, moving at her pace, ready to support her if needed. "Blackwood's men weren't just watching your claim," Patrick explained as they ventured deeper. "They were actively mining it, taking advantage of your absence." Elizabeth's expression hardened. "Thieves." "Yes, but what they found." Patrick led her around the bend to where the silver vein gleamed in the lamplight. Your father's dream wasn't misplaced, Elizabeth. Her breath caught as she took in the rich deposit. This is significant, much richer than anything we'd found before. Enough to make Blackwood desperate to claim it, Patrick agreed. And enough to secure your future if you can extract it safely. Elizabeth reached out, her fingers brushing the glittering ore. We'll need equipment. Miners. I can't work this alone, especially now. Patrick noted the practical shift in her thinking, not celebrating their good fortune, but immediately planning how to capitalize on it. The bank draft Blackwood provided should cover initial expenses. Elizabeth turned to him, determination in her eyes. Will you stay? Help me get this operation running properly. The question hung between them, weighted with more than just business implications. Patrick had planned to move on once Elizabeth was safe, continuing his solitary existence, avoiding putting down roots that could be torn up again. But something about this woman and her fierce spirit had worked its way under his skin. Yes, he found himself saying. I'll stay. At least until you're established. Relief washed over Elizabeth's features, along with something deeper that neither was ready to acknowledge. Thank you, Patrick. I couldn't do this alone. You could, he corrected gently, but you don't have to. The ride back to Martha's cabin was quieter, each lost in their own thoughts about what the future might hold. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the mountain trail, Elizabeth finally broke the silence. Where would you be now, if you hadn't stopped in Aspen? Patrick considered the question. Nowhere particular. That's been the point these past 2 years, just keeping moving, staying ahead of my thoughts. And now I'm exactly where I need to be, he replied, surprised by how true it felt. Elizabeth studied his profile, highlighted by the golden evening light. The marshal who isn't a marshal anymore. Just a man trying to find his way back to who he used to be, Patrick said softly. Perhaps, Elizabeth suggested, who you're becoming matters more than who you were. Their eyes met briefly, an understanding passing between them that needed no words. For two people who had lost so much, the possibility of finding something new, something meaningful, was both terrifying and exhilarating. The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Patrick reined in the wagon, instantly alert. Get down, he instructed, helping Elizabeth slide to the floor of the wagon before drawing his revolver. A lone rider appeared around the bend, approaching at a gallop. As he drew nearer, Patrick recognized Dr. Miller, his usually neat appearance disheveled from hard riding. Patrick, the doctor called, pulling his horse to a stop beside the wagon. Thank God I found you. You need to get back to town immediately. What's happened? Patrick demanded, noting the urgency in the older man's voice. Wilson's deputized a dozen men, Miller explained, catching his breath. They're calling it a posse, but it's nothing more than hired thugs. They're planning to arrest you for impersonating a federal officer and Elizabeth for theft and resisting arrest. Elizabeth pushed herself up from the wagon floor, wincing. But the charges were dropped. Blackwood signed a document. Blackwood's claiming he signed under duress, Miller interrupted. Says you threatened to kill him if he didn't comply. Patrick's jaw tightened. When is this happening? Tonight. They're gathering at the sheriff's office now. Martha sent me to warn you as soon as she heard. Patrick exchanged a glance with Elizabeth. We can't go back to Martha's. That's the first place they'll look. The mine, Elizabeth suggested. Patrick shook his head. Too obvious. We need somewhere they won't think to search, at least until we can figure out our next move. Dr. Miller cleared his throat. I might have a suggestion. There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles east of here in a box canyon. Few people know about it. I only found it when I was treating the old trapper for pneumonia last winter. He passed on, and as far as I know, no one's claimed it since. Patrick nodded decisively. That might work. Can you give us directions? As Miller described the route, Patrick's mind raced through their options. They couldn't run forever eventually, they'd need to clear their names or leave Colorado entirely. Neither prospect seemed promising at the moment. What about Martha? Elizabeth asked with concern. Will she be safe? Martha can take care of herself, Miller assured her. And Wilson has no cause to harm her. She's well respected in the community, even by those who fear the sheriff. Once they had clear directions to the cabin, Patrick thanked the doctor. We're in your debt, Dr. Miller. The elderly physician waved away the gratitude. Just doing what any decent man would do. Now go, before that posse gets organized. I'll try to delay them if I can, send them in the wrong direction. As Miller rode back toward town, Patrick turned the wagon east, away from both Aspen and the mine. Dusk was falling rapidly, the forest growing darker beneath the tall pines. We'll need supplies, Elizabeth noted, practical despite the circumstances. Food, blankets. The trapper's cabin might have some basics, Patrick replied, and I've got my rifle for hunting. We'll manage. Elizabeth touched his arm, her expression somber. I'm sorry, Patrick. You've been drawn into my fight and now you're a fugitive because of it. Patrick covered her hand with his own. This fight was mine from the moment I saw you tied to that post. I don't regret it, Elizabeth. The conviction in his voice silenced any further apologies. They continued eastward as night fell completely, guided only by starlight and Patrick's instincts for the trail. It was nearly midnight when they finally found the box canyon Miller had described. The trapper's cabin was well hidden among a stand of pines, its log walls weathered to a silvery gray that blended with the surrounding trees. Patrick helped Elizabeth down from the wagon, noting her exhaustion. The day's journey had clearly taken its toll on her still healing body. The cabin door creaked as Patrick pushed it open, his revolver ready. But the interior was empty, a layer of dust covering the simple furnishings: a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed against the far wall. Home sweet home, Patrick murmured, lighting a lantern he found hanging by the door. At least until we figure out our next move. Elizabeth entered slowly, taking in their temporary sanctuary. It's not the Astor house, but it will do. Patrick smiled at her attempt at humor. You take the bed. I'll make do with my bedroll. Too tired to argue, Elizabeth sank onto the edge of the mattress. What will we do, Patrick? We can't hide forever. Patrick moved to the fireplace, checking the chimney before starting a small fire to ward off the mountain chill. No, we can't, he agreed. But we have one advantage: Blackwood and Wilson don't know about the rich silver vein yet. They think they're fighting for a moderately valuable claim. If they knew what we found, they'd never stop hunting us, Elizabeth finished grimly. Which means we need leverage, something to make them back off permanently. Patrick stoked the growing flames, his face thoughtful in the flickering light. What kind of leverage could possibly work against men like that? Elizabeth asked, her voice heavy with fatigue. Patrick turned to her, determination evident in his stance. I don't know yet, but we'll find it. For now, rest. You need to heal and we're safe here for the moment. Elizabeth wanted to argue to help plan their next steps, but the day's exertions had drained what little strength she'd regained. With Patrick's help, she settled onto the bed, careful of her injured back. Patrick, she murmured as sleep began to claim her, thank you for not abandoning me. Patrick sat beside her on the edge of the bed, his expression softening. That was never a possibility, Elizabeth. Now sleep. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. As Elizabeth drifted into exhausted slumber, Patrick remained at her side, watching the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. In just over a week, this woman had become important to him in ways he hadn't thought possible after Laramie. The realization should have frightened him. sent him running as he had for the past 2 years. Instead, it anchored him, giving purpose to days that had previously been filled with aimless wandering. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Of that, at least, he was certain. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the pine needles surrounding the cabin. Patrick had spent most of the night planning their next moves while keeping the fire burning steadily. Now, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin's single window, he carefully added more wood to the flames. Elizabeth stirred, her eyes opening slowly as she oriented herself to their unfamiliar surroundings. "What time is it?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep. "Just after dawn," Patrick replied, moving to pour water from his canteen into a tin cup. "How are you feeling?" Elizabeth pushed herself carefully to a sitting position, wincing slightly. "Better than yesterday. The rest helped." She accepted the water gratefully. "Have you slept at all?" "I'll rest later," Patrick evaded, turning his attention to his saddlebags. "I have some jerky and hardtack. Not much of a breakfast, but it'll do until I can hunt something more substantial." Elizabeth watched him, noting the shadows beneath his eyes and the tightness in his shoulders. "You've been thinking all night. What have you come up with?" Patrick sat across from her on one of the chairs, his expression serious. "We have 3 options as I see it. First, we could leave Colorado, start over somewhere else. Second, we could try to clear our names legally, which means finding proof of Wilson and Blackwood's corruption that would stand up in court. Or third, Elizabeth prompted when he hesitated. "We fight back," Patrick said simply. "Use what we know about the silver vein as leverage. Offer Blackwood a partnership, a legitimate one, in exchange for clearing our names and ending this vendetta." Elizabeth's brow furrowed. "Partner with the man who tried to steal my claim and had me publicly whipped. I'd rather starve." "I understand the sentiment," Patrick acknowledged. "But sometimes practical solutions require unpleasant compromises. And sometimes principles matter more than practicality," Elizabeth countered, a spark of the fire Patrick so admired lighting her eyes. "My father didn't spend his last years searching for that silver, only to have his daughter hand half of it to the man who may have been responsible for his death." Patrick nodded, respecting her conviction even as he worried about its consequences. "Then we're left with running or fighting the legal battle." Elizabeth sipped her water, considering. "I won't run, Patrick. This claim, this land, it's all I have left of my father, and more than that, it's mine. I've earned it with sweat and blood." Her fingers unconsciously traced the line of her shoulder where the whip had cut deepest. "If we run, Wilson and Blackwood win, not just the silver but the satisfaction of driving us out. Then we fight," Patrick concluded. "But we'll need evidence, documents, witnesses, something concrete that proves their corruption." "Blackwood's confession," Elizabeth suggested. Patrick shook his head. "He's already claimed it was signed under duress. We need more." Elizabeth's expression grew thoughtful. "What about the mine records? When a claim changes hands, it's recorded with the mining district office. If Blackwood's men were planning to take over my claim officially, there might be paperwork, perhaps even forged documents ready to be filed." "The mining district office is in Aspen," Patrick pointed out. "Walking into town right now would be suicide." "Not for everyone," Elizabeth countered. "What about Dr. Miller? He could access the records without raising suspicion." Patrick considered this, seeing the merit in her suggestion. "It's worth trying, but we need to get word to him somehow." "Martha," Elizabeth decided. "She comes and goes from town regularly. No one would question her presence." Patrick nodded slowly. "It could work. We need to get a message to Martha, asking her to contact Miller." He rose, moving to look out the window at the surrounding forest. "I'll ride out today, circle wide around Aspen to avoid the posse, and try to reach Martha's cabin after dark. No, Elizabeth objected, rising from the bed with more strength than she'd shown the previous day. It's too dangerous for you to go alone. Wilson's men will be watching for you specifically. And you're in no condition to travel, Patrick countered gently. Elizabeth straightened, ignoring the pain the movement caused. I'm stronger than I look, Patrick. And two sets of eyes are better than one when avoiding a posse. Patrick studied her, noting the determination in her stance despite the pallor of her skin. You've been through enough, Elizabeth. Let me handle this part. This is my fight too, she insisted. More than that, it began as my fight and you joined it. I won't sit safely in this cabin while you risk your life on my behalf. Their gazes locked in silent argument, neither willing to yield. Finally, Patrick sighed. We'll go together, but at the first sign you're struggling, we stop. Agreed. Elizabeth nodded, relief evident in her expression. Agreed. When do we leave? After you eat something and I check your bandages, Patrick replied, his tone making it clear this point wasn't negotiable. As they prepared for the journey, Patrick found himself both admiring Elizabeth's resilience and worrying about her safety. The woman had an inner strength that matched any he'd encountered in his years. As a marshal, a quiet determination that refused to bend, even when circumstances warranted practical compromise. It was that same quality that had first drawn him to her in Aspen's town square, that defiance in the face of injustice that resonated with something long dormant within himself. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. Patrick had carefully rebandaged Elizabeth's back, noting with relief that the wounds were healing cleanly. They left the wagon hidden among the trees it would be too easily spotted, and Patrick helped Elizabeth mount Midnight, then climbed up behind her. It's a long ride, he warned as they set off. Tell me if you need to rest. Elizabeth nodded, though Patrick suspected she'd endure considerable discomfort before admitting weakness. They rode south initially, away from both Aspen and the mine, before circling west through dense forest that would help conceal their passage. The day wore on, the sun climbing to its zenith, and then beginning its slow descent toward the western mountains. They stopped occasionally to rest and drink from streams they crossed, but Elizabeth never complained, though Patrick could feel the tension in her body as the hours passed. It was nearing dusk when they finally approached Martha's cabin from the east, using the cover of the forest to survey the area before approaching. No horses were visible, no smoke rose from the chimney. Something's wrong, Patrick murmured, drawing his revolver. Martha wouldn't leave the fire go out in this weather. They dismounted at the edge of the trees, Patrick helping Elizabeth down before tethering Midnight securely. Stay here, he instructed, his voice low. No, Elizabeth whispered back. We go together. Patrick wanted to argue but recognized the futility. Instead, he handed her his spare revolver. Stay behind me, and if anything happens, ride for Dr. Miller's in town. With careful steps, they approached the cabin. The stillness surrounding it raised the hairs on Patrick's neck. No birdsong. No sounds of Martha's chickens that usually pecked around the yard. The door stood slightly ajar. Patrick pushed it open with the barrel of his gun, revealing an interior in disarray. Furniture had been overturned, Martha's belongings scattered across the floor. They were looking for us, Elizabeth whispered, taking in the destruction. Patrick moved through the cabin methodically, checking each corner. No blood, he noted with relief. Martha isn't here, but I don't think she was harmed. Then where is she? Elizabeth asked, concern evident in her voice. Before Patrick could answer, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them. He moved quickly to the window, peering through the gathering darkness. Riders coming, he reported tersely. At least 4, maybe more. Elizabeth joined him at the window, her face paling. "Wilson, can't tell yet, but we're not waiting to find out." Patrick took her arm, guiding her toward the back door. "We need to reach the trees before they see us." They slipped out the back of the cabin and hurried toward the forest edge, keeping low. The hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied now by men's voices. Just as they reached the shelter of the pines, a shout went up from behind them. "There, by the trees!" A gunshot cracked through the evening air, the bullet splintered